You have your Bible with you. Please go ahead and open up to Matthew chapter 22. That's where we're going to be here tonight. That's where we're going to park it, pitch our tent, however you want to label that. And so as you're turning there, I'd like to share a brief marine story that I know I haven't told you. In 2007, as I began school at Longwood University, one day there came an invitation in the mail, and it looked like junk mail. It looked like something that wasn't that important. It looked like something that, man, I really don't want to open this because I've got better things to do than to sift through the mail. But on it, as I looked at the envelope, said, from U.S. Senator Jim Webb, who at the time was a senator for Virginia. And so at that moment, I said, well, I don't know Jim Webb personally, so I probably better open the mail. And in it was an invitation to come to Washington as part of a campaign to reform the GI Bill. And so on that invitation, it laid out what I could expect once I came to Washington. I figured it'd be a bunch of arguing, but it wasn't that. And so what the senator wanted me to do was to meet him and to meet John Warner, who has since passed. But also there would be the opportunity to go and do an interview on Fox News about the need to reform the GI Bill. Now, what would have happened if I had just said, you know what, I got better things to do? What if I had just cast that piece of mail, that invitation, into the trash? Because that was actually one of the best experiences that I had ever had. I got to sit for 30 minutes with Jim Webb and talk about the Vietnam War. I got to sit for probably 30 to 45 minutes with John Warner, who literally at that point in time, I think he was around 80 years old, was walking, talking piece of history, who had shown us all the things that he had collected from each administration that he had worked with. And then I got to go on Fox News for about a 5-minute interview about the need to overhaul the GI Bill to make it more accessible and adaptable for veterans who were returning from Iraq and Afghanistan. And that would have only taken place, or that only took place, because not only did I accept the invitation, but because, lo and behold, that had been the second invitation that they had sent my family. The first one got thrown in the trash. So I'm thankful that I accepted that invitation. I'm thankful that, whatever small part I played in that process, eventually there was a bill that was presented before the Senate and the House. And today, the GI Bill has been reformed. See, in our life, there are going to be multiple opportunities and multiple instances where we get invited to something. March 18th, I hope that there are many people who respond to the invitation to come to Friends and Family Day. Each Sunday is an invitation, standalone invitation for people to gather together with God's people to learn His Word. And so Jesus in Matthew chapter 22 talks about a different type of invitation. It's an invitation that is also always stands alone, that is separate and apart from any other invitation that anybody could ever receive. And there's only a certain type of person that gets that type of invitation. And there are definitely two different types of people that react and respond to that invitation. But this invitation is completely and totally different than, say, an invitation to go to Washington. This is an invitation that is definitely different from Friends and Family Day. See, this invitation that Jesus is going to talk about in Matthew chapter 22 is the invitation to eternity. And there are markers within chapter 22 that lead us down a road to the types of people who respond to the invitation to eternity. See, Jesus is in the middle of telling a group of parables to a certain group of people. A group of people who believe that they are in the right when in all actuality they are in the wrong. They're a group of people who claim Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and believe that that is good enough for them to sustain a relationship with God. It's a group of people who believe that as long as they check the box, they're okay. And so Jesus, after he just told the parable of the tenants, starts again with another parable in verse 1. And again, Jesus spoke to them. Them here is the Jewish crowd that has gathered to hear him talk. And he spoke to them in parables, saying, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding feast for his son. Once again, note that in your Bible, that Jesus, when he tells parables, always tells them in relationship to what the kingdom is going to be like. And he says it's comparable to a king who gave a wedding feast for his son and sent his servants and called those who were invited to the wedding feast, but they would not come. Think about that in the first century context, or even think about that in a modern day context. Every so often there's a royal family over in England and they have somebody that gets married, and you know what they do? They send out invitations to people who are important, and they invite the world into their family atmosphere to watch the most expensive, longest, arduous wedding ever. And there are only two responses to that. There are only two responses to that invitation, and there are only two responses to this invitation. Either a person will say they are going, or a person will say, I'm not coming. And it's clear here that as the king begins to invite people, he sends out his servants and he wants to know, are you going to come and participate in the party? Are you going to come and participate in the feast that I've laid out? To celebrate who? My son. Are you going to celebrate my son and his pairing with his wife? And at the first instance, they say, no, they will not come. And that's the hard part about being a Christian. That's the hard part about evangelism. That's the hard part about trying to make an impact, to make a difference in the community that surrounds us, is that there are often times, and there will be times, that no matter what we do, no matter what we say, no matter how hard we work to get people to respond to the invitation to come and feast with Jesus Christ at his table, that for whatever reason they will say no. But that's not a reason to quit inviting people to the feast. And that's the same thing that takes place with this king. The king sends out one invitation and people say no. So he sends his servants again. And again, he sent other servants in verse 4 saying, tell those who are invited, see, I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and my fat calves have been slaughtered and everything is ready. Come to the wedding feast. And so maybe the people don't respond the first time because they're not sure exactly what they're to expect at this feast. And so the king makes it obvious and clear, crystal clear, that what they're going to get if they come to this wedding feast is anything and everything that they could ever imagine a feast could possibly be. See, in the first century, to slaughter the oxen and to slaughter the fat calf was a sign that, hey, these things are not only important, but these things are the delicacies of the day. They are the premium meal for a premium event served by a premium and excellent king. And notice, there's nothing that anybody who's invited has to prepare. Because oftentimes when there was a wedding, the family put on the feast, but there was also people who came who were related to the family or friends of the family, and they would also help out with the feast and the ceremony and things like that. But this king says, if you come to my feast, if you accept my invitation, I just want you to know everything is already in place. And we need to make sure that as we go out and we invite people into a relationship with Jesus, as we invite them to take part in this ultimate feast that will last forever, as we invite them into a relationship, into a community known as the church, that they are not required to do anything to earn the salvation that they seek, the hope that they desire, the peace that surpasses all understanding. See, the only thing that people here have to do to partake of the wedding feast, they don't have to work, they don't have to prepare, they just have to move towards the king and accept his gracious gift. And it seems as if, that hopefully that they would look at the king's invitation, they would understand that all things have been prepared and the only thing they have to do is show up, and that they would accept the invitation with glad hearts, that they would accept the invitation without reservation, that even though they said no once, they would take the opportunity upon the second invitation to accept what the king had offered. But notice the attitude of the people in verse 5. But they paid no attention and went off, one to his farm, another to his business, while the rest seized his servants, treated them shamefully, and killed them. And so we see a conglomerate of responses just here in verse 5 through 6. Is that the people who were invited had different reasons for why they didn't accept the invitation. And notice the reasons why they didn't. That sometimes people will not accept the invitation to eternity because they are distracted by the ways and the means and the desires and the influence of the world, of themselves. See, the invitation to this grand feast was put off because one person simply wanted to tend to the farm. And here's the question. If he owned the farm, did he not also have servants who could take care of that business while he went to the feast? Certainly he could. And certainly he had those servants that could have done that. And then another person went off to his business. See, in this situation, it's the person who owns the business who is so consumed by the business of the day, who is so consumed and controlled and compelled by the almighty dollar, almighty denarii maybe, in the first century, that they have no desire to attend a wedding feast that they could definitely partake in with no responsibility to help prepare. See, and that describes most people in the 21st century. That there are people in the world who will use just about any excuse to decline the invitation. And then verse 6 talks about the response and the results of those who give the invitation. See, while the rest seized his servants. See, the servants work on behalf of the master, behalf of the king. And in going back again to the people who they wanted to come to the feast, they were treated shamefully. And not just shamefully, they were killed. And that's a representation of those who would follow Jesus. That if you ask long enough, and if you are persistent enough in relaying the gospel to people, in inviting people to the great feast, in inviting people to eternity, an invitation for eternity, an invitation for the grand feast, at some point, at some time, people will treat you like the dog they think you are. And why is that? Because here's the thing. Jesus is the ultimate mirror. And if you hold a mirror in somebody's face long enough, they'll begin to see the flaws. They'll begin to see the scars. And when you do that spiritually to people, you do that long enough and people have no desire to adjust or to really reconcile or to look at the scars that they have, both morally and spiritually, the emptiness that is within them. They have no desire to really see who they are in light of who Jesus is. Because Jesus is the one who is morally and ethically and spiritually perfect. And when you ask people and you inquire about people and their life, and when you challenge people to look at themselves in light of who Jesus is, we live in a society that does not want any invitation from any king. We live in a society that lives on the motto that they can simply do whatever they want with whoever they want as long as nobody gets hurt. We live in a society where success is having the ability to live your life the way that you want to live it and to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, and there is no moral accountability to anyone, much less this Jesus character. But in telling that society that that's the wrong way to live, and appealing to that society, and inviting that society into a relationship with Jesus, we should expect and not be surprised by persecution. But I also want to point out something about the servants. Notice that when the king told the servants to go back a second time, they never complained. Notice that when the king asked the servants to go back a second time, you didn't hear, well, what if they kill us? Or what if they treat us bad? Or what if they reject us? Or what if they say some things that hurt and they pierce me emotionally? See, the servants didn't worry about all that stuff because they understood that the king and the invitation of the king was greater than what they might face temporarily. And too often we allow the opinions of other people to shape what we'll talk to them about or talk with them about. See, here's the thing. It's easy to talk about the weather, especially given the rain and the cold that we've had. It's easy to talk about the weather because I'm not morally accountable to the weather. See, it's easy to talk about sports because I'm not morally accountable to any type of owner, to any other team. It's easy to talk about all the things that take place in local government or state government or DC because I'm not morally accountable to a senator. But sometimes, in the face of what may happen, we can fold because, well, what if they reject me? Or what if I don't know enough? Or what if they kill me. But here's the thing. In giving the invitation for eternity, the good Lord has promised us that those who give that invitation have already secured their place at the table. That those who have already accepted the invitation to eternity and go and invite others have already been promised a time and place that lasts forever, with no pain, with no tears, with no suffering, with no sun and no moon, because it's the good Lord and his Son who provide that radiant light that shines forever and ever. And so in understanding that, I ask this question: what is there to fear? What is there to be worried about? What is there on this earth that can actually keep us from offering the invitation for people to experience eternity through a relationship with Jesus Christ? But notice the other thing that's mentioned here, starting in verse 7. See, the king, in relationship to the servants, absolutely, positively cares about those who offer the invitation for others to come to the feast. Because as these servants are mistreated and as these servants are killed, note that the king was angry. See, as the church, we are the apple of God's eye. That no matter what takes place here on earth, no matter what pain or suffering that we experience from the outside world, we can rest assured that when that takes place, God is angry with the people who hurt the church. And in representing the king here, what is going to happen to those who hurt the church, to those who hurt God's people? And it says that he sent his troops and destroyed those murderers and burnt their city. And he said to the servants of the wedding feast, the wedding feast is ready, but those invited were not worthy. See, here he's talking about the Jews. It's the Jewish people, the religious elite here, who said, we don't want anything to do with Jesus. It's also the religious elite in the world who really say, I don't want anything to do with Jesus. And so what takes place? The invitation, where it might be stifled and rejected in one place, the king always says, here's another spot where the invitation can thrive, where the invitation can be offered to the people who want to come to the feast. And that's exactly what takes place here. He says, go therefore to the main roads and invite to the wedding feast as many as you find. And those servants went out into the roads and gathered all whom they found, both the bad and the good. And kind of as we talked about this morning, if we're going to make a difference, we have to be different. And notice where the servants went. The servants went to everyone, both the righteous and the unrighteous, both the sick and the well, both the moral and the immoral, both the rich and the poor. So the wedding hall was filled. You can rest assured that as we go from place to place, as we engage with each type of person, God has guaranteed on the day of judgment and for eternity that eternity will be full of who? People that accept the invitation. And there's so many people in the world who believe that they can simply live the way that they want to live, and they'll be treated as if they actually accepted the invitation without actually accepting it. And so in verse 11 it says, "But the king came in and looked at the guests, and he saw there a man who had no wedding garment." See, when you went to a wedding feast back in the day, way back in the day, first century day, people who came had to wear the right stuff, because it signified that they had actually been invited, and these garments would be given by the host family so that people who were on the outside looking in couldn't just sneak in and wedding crash, so to speak, and reap the benefits of the hard work of the family and reap the benefits of those who had been invited without actually being invited. And so the king comes in and he notes that there's somebody who didn't have on the right garments. And he said to him, "Friend, how did you get in here without wedding garments?" And see, that's a very good question. Because here's the thing, in order to partake in the feast of eternity, you gotta be wearing the right thing. Or should I say, you have to be wearing the right person in the recesses of your heart and soul. And the Bible's completely and totally clear about that. In Galatians chapter 3, verses 26 and 27, as Paul talks about that there are no people there's no partiality, both Jew and Greek, both male and female, that those who have been baptized into Christ have been clothed with him. They have put on Christ as their spiritual and moral garment. They've accepted the invitation to the grand wedding. They have accepted the invitation to eternity. And notice the response of the person who is not wearing the proper garments. "And he was speechless." It's a sombering point that should be taken to heart to all those who desire to see people saved. It is that there are those who mistakenly think that they'll be present at the feast with the right clothes on, and the king and the judge will say, "How'd you get here?" And they'll be speechless. And I don't want that for anybody. Whether it's anyone here tonight or people that we come in contact with outside of these walls. Because the response to that, or the consequence of that, is the following. "Then the king said to the attendants, 'Bind him hand and foot and cast him into outer darkness, in the place where there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen.'" And who knows, maybe this was one of those people who attended the farms. Maybe this was one of the people who was more concerned about their business. Maybe this was one of the people who treated the servant shamefully. Maybe this was one of the people who actually killed the servant of the king and expected the king to treat him as a servant. That's not going to happen on the day of judgment. And I don't know the stats with regards to population of Gaston County, but I do know this. It's pretty big. How's that for statistical accuracy? Gaston County, big. Gastonia, wouldn't classify it as small. And the question we have to ask ourselves as people who have accepted the invitation for eternity, people who will be present at that glorious feast, is this: are we offering wedding garments to people? Are we asking people? Are we giving them that invitation? As often and as consistently as possible. And then the second thing we have to ask ourselves is this: are we still committed to being present on feast day? See, it's one thing to accept the invitation. It's another thing to be committed to going to the feast. See, I received some passes this evening to a famous hotel here in North Carolina. And it's one thing to take the pass. It's another thing to actually go there. It's one thing to say, I'm a Christian. It's another thing to develop that within ourselves and to cultivate that in other people. And so certainly I'm glad that you're here tonight, but I want to encourage us as, we begin to wind down this evening to do a couple of things. One, look for those opportunities to provide an invitation to the feast. But two, find somebody within our own church family to cultivate Christ-likeness in. To mentor somebody. Whether that's a fellow friend, whether that's someone you may not know as well as you could. Or maybe it's a young person who's in high school, who either is getting ready to go to college, or maybe they're in their formative years as a freshman or a sophomore. Maybe that's somebody on the outside that's outside of the church that's of that age. Because when we do that, we're like these servants who go out and they seek to implant or give this invitation to all of the people that they come across, whether they are good, whether they are bad, whether they're old, whether they are young. And in doing that, that cultivates growth within ourselves. Because the invitation to eternity is not only the greatest invitation you'll ever give, it's also the greatest feast we'll ever be a part of. Let's not just dwell on these things as we stand and sing. Let's commit to these things forever. And so with that, we'll go ahead and have the invitation song. What's the number?
837.
837.